Okay, hi gang. This is the first in a series of, let's say, bite-sized videos I'm going to do. What I'm going to look at doing is, say, topics within topics. So we do sections. We have presidential section, judicial section. We're moving into campaigns and elections. What I'm going to do is break down campaigns and elections into different topics within that overall section, in the hopes that it allows me to do some more things with the videos. Maybe we'll see, maybe we won't. But but it won't increase confusion as to what people are looking for. I'll have them labeled, obviously, like campaigns and elections, primaries and caucuses, which is what this video is on. It's one of the makeup videos for our recent snow day. Yeah. And on that, let's begin. What we're looking at is how we back up. Every 4 years we vote for the President of the United States. We have a Democratic candidate and a Republican candidate. All right? Last time we had Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. We will vote for one of those two candidates, and whoever gets the most electoral votes wins the election, right? You need 270 electoral votes to win the election. The way we decide the presidential candidates is similar to the process of how we decide the president. So each state gets a certain number of electors. This is in the presidential election. The electors are based upon the congressional representation of the state, which is loosely based on the state's population, right? And whoever wins the state wins all those votes from the electoral, all those electors that will then go to the electoral college. So Mitt Romney won North Carolina, he got 15 electors. In the presidential primary season, I said season for a reason, talk about that in a second. Each state gets a number of delegates. They're called delegates, not electors, but each state gets a number of delegates in proportion to its population. So Vermont will get less delegates than Texas, which will get less delegates than California. Makes sense. Each party assigns how many, because the primaries are internal party systems, each party determines how many delegates each state gets, but they do determine each state's number of delegates based on the population of that state. Primary season. Primary season lasts during the election year from about January to about June. In the general election, when all states vote on the same day, during the presidential primaries, the states vote over a 6-month period. Now, each state votes during one day, but on one day we might have one state vote. On another day we might have 7 states vote. On another day we might have another state vote. We might go 2 weeks without any states voting. Things like that. The order of who gets to vote is a subject to some controversy, which we'll talk about in a moment. So I've called this the presidential primaries and the presidential primary season. It's going to get a little confusing because I'm going to tell you that within the presidential primaries, there are things called primaries and there are things called caucuses. So first, the primary. Primary is pretty simple to understand. It's just like how we go and vote in the general election. During a presidential primary, you go into a voting booth cast your ballot for whoever you want to be president, the presidential candidate from your party, and then you hand that ballot off, and then you leave. Pretty simple, right? Now, there are two types of primaries. There's an open primary, and there's a closed primary. The open primary, in an open primary, you can choose which party's election you want to vote in. In a closed primary, you can only vote for the party's primary in which you're registered. Here's an example. I'm a registered unaffiliated voter. In an open primary, I can go to the voting booth and ask to either vote in the Democratic or the Republican primary. They'll give me a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot. In an open primary, if I'm registered as a Democrat, I can go to the voting precinct and I can say, may I have a Republican ballot so I can vote in the Republican presidential primary? And they'll say, of course you can. Now you can only vote in one party's primary, but you have a choice as to whose party's primary you want to vote for or vote in. Now, in a closed primary, if you are a registered Democrat, you can only vote in the Democratic primary. If you're a registered Republican, you can only vote in the Republican primary. If you're an unaffiliated voter or an independent voter, some states allow you, even in a closed primary, to go ahead and choose which party to choose a ballot from either party to vote in. Other states, though, say if you're unaffiliated, you cannot vote in any primary. You're not a registered Republican. You're not a registered Democrat. What business do you have voting in either one of those parties' primaries? All right. So you got open primaries and you got closed primaries. A primary, like a North Carolina primary, is an election just like a general election. So caucuses. Caucuses are different from primaries in that you don't vote necessarily with a ballot, but you kind of vote with your body, and you vote in public with a whole bunch of other people. So you get together with your neighbors, your friends, kind of. Essentially, you get together with everybody that votes in your same precinct, and you try and convince one another to support your chosen party candidate. So let's say there's a presidential caucus between Katy Perry, Kesha, Lady Gaga, and Taylor Swift. There are 50 people, okay, that are at the caucus. At the beginning of the caucus, you may have 30 minutes or so for various people to stand up and give 2 to 3 minute speeches about who they're supporting and why, whatever. After that, people will move to one corner of the room or another based upon the candidate they support. Katy Perry supporters may go to the left-hand corner of the room. Kesha supporters may go to the right-hand corner of the room. Back right hand, back left hand. Taylor Swift supporters may go to the front right hand, and Gaga supporters may go to the front left hand corner of the room. They will then each give some speeches as to maybe why they support their candidate, or they'll try and jostle other people to come and support them. That process will go on. You'll have that mingling, a whole bunch of people talking to each other, let's say for another 30 minutes. And then they'll say, all right, stop. Go to the corners of the parties or the candidates you support. Now, at the end of that, Katy Perry has 25 people supporting her. Kesha has 15 people supporting her. Lady Gaga has 10 people supporting her. And nobody supports Taylor Swift. She's great and all, but right now she's having like a feud with Katy Perry, so we gotta kick her out pretty quickly. Okay? Sorry, Taylor Swift. Okay, Generally, in the caucuses, there's a minimum vote threshold. It's like 15% generally. Let's say Taylor Swift had one vote, had one person on her side in that last section. She would have had 2% of the vote. Taylor Swift would have been knocked out of the caucus in that precinct because she had less than 15% of the vote. So that person would either have to abstain or would have to go and move into Gaga, Katy Perry, or Kesha's camp. All right. In this scenario, Katy Perry wins 50% of the vote, Kesha won 30%, and Gaga won 20% of the vote. Okay. Let's say there were 100 delegates that Iowa had to give out, and that was the final result. Katy Perry would win 50 delegates, Kesha would win 30 delegates, and Lady Gaga would win 20 delegates. Why? Because it's a concept I haven't introduced yet. Proportional representation. In a proportional representation system, the percentage of vote that each candidate gets will equal roughly the percentage of the total delegates the candidate gets. All right. So if Katy Perry got 50% of the vote, she get 50 delegates because it's a proportional representation system. That's different than a winner-take-all system where Katy Perry, having won 50% of the vote, having won the most vote, would take all the delegates home, 100 delegates. While in the presidential primary system, most states vote in a proportional representation system. Some states are still winner-take-all. A lot of Republican states are winner-take-all. Republicans don't use the proportional representation system as much as the Democrats do. Now, this matters a lot. This proportional representation system matters a lot because even if a candidate wins a state, and there's a lot of talk about who wins a state. Let's say Hillary Clinton won a state 52% to 48%. We'll all talk about how Hillary Clinton came out on top, how Hillary Clinton won the state, how people support Clinton or whatever. In reality, though, if there's 100 delegates from that state, Clinton would end up with 52 delegates and Obama would end up with 48 delegates. Let's say we're trying to get to 2,000 delegates overall. Once you get 2,000 delegates, you win the election, just like once you get 270 electoral votes, you win the election. While Hillary Clinton won the state, they essentially tied, kind of, in the delegate count. When we're looking at the march to getting that 2,000 delegates that you need, there's really not that much difference there. And this actually makes a huge deal because if you were to give delegates, if the Democrats gave delegates based upon a winner-take-all system, Hillary Clinton would have won the 2008 presidential primary, not Obama. If you see here, the states Clinton won are in gold, the states Obama won are in purple. If we were to add up the delegates from all those states in a winner-take-all system, Clinton would have won the 2008 primary. However, that's not the system that the Democrats have. They have a proportional representation system. We can look at here and see the percentage that each candidate won by. If you notice, neither candidate in a lot of the states, especially the bigger states, they didn't win by a huge margin. So while Clinton won, let's say, the state of Texas or won the state of California, she only won those states by between, maybe 1 to 10%, which means that even though California has 441 delegates, Clinton might have gotten 270 of those delegates, and Obama might have gotten 171 of those delegates. Clinton still got more delegates. However, overall, it wasn't a complete loss for Obama. You keep doing that in all these different states, and at the end of the day, we find that Obama ends up with more delegates because he got more of the vote. It's the same reason why in 2000, while Gore won the popular vote for president, Bush won the electoral vote. There are 3 states that always go first. Well, in a sequence. Iowa and the Iowa caucuses are always first, and Iowa always votes by itself. That is, takes place in the first or second week of January. Iowa votes first. Next, the week after that, you have New Hampshire, that votes by itself. And then the week after that, generally, you have South Carolina, which generally will vote by itself. Now, here's why that order matters. The states that go first get to set the narrative for the rest of the campaign. Okay, so while when we go into an election, we know that, say, for the Republican side, Mitt Romney has 40% of the Republican support, Mike Huckabee has 15% of the Republican support, John McCain has 20% of the Republican support or something. In a state like Iowa, maybe Mike Huckabee wins that state. Now, we aren't relying on projections of who wins or loses anymore. We have an actual result that we can look at. Now, even though there's no way in hell that Mike Huckabee, hell, because he's a minister, no way that Mike Huckabee is going to win the Republican presidential primary. He is now seen as being the front runner, has a strong sort of media narrative push behind him. So Iowa gets to go first. They get to establish the first winner. Even if, again, lots of times the winner is Mike Huckabee with 36% of the vote, and then the other candidates have like 30%, 25%, 10%, something like that. And the difference between 36% of the vote and 30% of the vote is basically nothing. You get the same amount of delegates, but you still get to say you won the state. You go to New Hampshire, which is a primary, meaning you vote sort of with the ballot. And then you go to South Carolina, which is also a primary, where you vote with the ballot. Those 3 states get to very quickly determine the front runner for each side during the presidential campaign. There's something similar about those states that cause people to suggest maybe this isn't fair that these states get to go first and get to establish the front runners and things like that. Iowa and New Hampshire are 2 of the whitest states in the United States. They are white. They are super white. They are bright white. They're blindingly white. In New Hampshire, you don't know if there are people there at all during the winter because they blended with the snow. They're white, 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 white. New Hampshire is about 96% super white. Iowa is about 91% white. White. These states are white, way whiter than the national average. South Carolina is a more diverse state. It's about 68 or so percent white, which is 10% lower than the national average. But South Carolina is super evangelical conservative, like way more conservative than the rest of the country altogether. Very conservative. The Democrats in South Carolina are conservatives. The Democrats in South Carolina are Republicans in California. So we have white Slovenia and Whiteistan, Iowa and New Hampshire, deciding, being the first out of the gates to decide who might be the front runner for president. And then you got Christendom, South Carolina, deciding being the third state to decide who should be the um, respective parties' presidential candidates. These are not representative of the country at home. However, they have a huge outsized impact. A win in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, even if you don't have broad national appeal, can give you legitimacy, and with that legitimacy can come in the campaign dollars that you might not ordinarily have had. Now, Iowa, while being a super white place, is a pretty bluish purple state overall. Okay? However, it's got a very strong conservative evangelical sort of vein to it. Caucuses are unique in that they take a lot of time. You might be there for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours. That's a lot of time to dedicate on a Tuesday night to voting. Okay, so only the most determined / crazy people go out there to vote for their party's presidential candidate, which means in Iowa, only the insane get to are the ones that decide their presidential candidate instead of sort of a more representative sample of Iowa altogether. So now you have white Slovenia getting the first say in who's going to be the legitimate candidate, who's going to have front runner status. But you have the most out of step members of that white Slovenia crowd getting to make that decision. Okay, so that's why Mike Huckabee, for example, can win states like Iowa. That's why Mike Huckabee appeals to that very strong Christian conservative voter who's also very white. And those people vote a lot. They are very, very dependable voting bloc. People from the moderate or establishment candidates, your Mitt Romney, for example, he's supported by most Republicans, maybe, but they got other things to do. Fear factor's on tonight. I don't want to go to the caucus. Go Mitt Romney, but I'm gonna stay here and watch people eat bugs because that's what I'm gonna do. So you have a lineup of states. You got Iowa, which, because of its caucus, is kind of like South Carolina in who goes out and votes. You have New Hampshire, which is wider than Iowa, which is already extremely white. And then you got South Carolina voting, which is extremely conservative. And it's almost like it's the second South Carolina to vote because the first set of South Carolina to vote, the Iowa caucus members, were the first ones to vote, if that makes sense. So there's been a lot of controversy over the fact that those 3 states are the ones that go first because they get a disproportionate say in who might become president because they're the first in lines to vote. They get to make their voices heard first. People get to say, hey, Iowans voted for me. I'm the only one who's actually won an election. None of these other people who are running for the Republican nomination have won anything. I have won. So there's been some talk of maybe changing it, maybe allowing a state like Texas or California vote right up there near the beginning. But so far that movement hasn't really gone anywhere. There's also the argument that places like Iowa and New Hampshire would get drowned out. Nobody would pay any attention to them if Texas voted on the same day as Iowa and New Hampshire because Texas is freaking huge. There's a lot of delegates at a state. Why are you going to go to Iowa and campaign for its, 15 delegates or whatever when you could spend your time in Texas and maybe get 150 delegates. Alrighty, end of that video. Talk about the presidential conventions later on. Live long and prosper.